Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out here in the direction of Robotyne, where the Russians have now fully 100% recaptured the Surovikin line, where they've got every single part of it under their control with this recent advancement, allowing them to now have full control over the anti-tank ditch, as well as the Dragon Teeth fortifications, as well as the trench going through the northern parts of Verbove. And with these advancements, we see that the Russians are now one step closer to capturing the fortifications here to the east of Robotyne, both in the eastern direction, and fighting continues here in the western direction, mostly positional fighting, as the Russians so far are not storming Robotyne again after they were pushed out and the Ukrainians recaptured the fortifications to the south. So the fighting right now is positional to the east and to the west of Robotyne, where there are some advances to the east, and the Russians are getting closer and closer and capturing more and more fortifications to the east of Robotyne to allow them to have a much more successful storming of the village after they've captured all of these spaces around it. We also have this geolocated footage here to confirm this advance by the Russians, and it shows that the Russians are moving through with small infantry assault groups under the cover of artillery, and they're also being hit by Ukrainian FPV drones. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Novomykhalivka, the Russians here launched an armored assault here to the west of Novomykhalivka, flanking the Ukrainian positions there, while at the same time launching attacks in the center of the town. And with this, we see that the Russians have reached the outskirts of Novomykhalivka, but what happened from then on, there is no information about. What we see is from the Ukrainian side, where they show this footage here of a drone flying overhead, the Russians storming the town from the southwestern parts, where they drop off a bunch of soldiers here by the forest lines. We see that the forest lines shown in this footage is this one right here to the south of Novomykhalivka. We see that there are these forest areas here, and right by the road here in between, we see the majority of the filming taking place. It is both here in the direction of the east towards the central parts of Novomykhalivka and in the northern direction by the forest area. So we're seeing that infantry is dropped off by the forest area before the armored vehicles drive back down and move to the east here towards the central parts. So they're withdrawing to the other parts where they will support the Russians fighting in the central parts of the town. We can see in this footage here that the forest area is also a lot just a march, which makes it very difficult for anyone to move through, impossible for armored vehicles to move through, but the infantry can move through with a lot of care. We can see that there is this road that goes through the march, but it's very likely highly mined, which makes it, again, impossible for armored vehicles to drive through without being blown up. So we're seeing that they are dropping off this infantry to have the possibility of entering the town here from the southwest. It was a very risky maneuver and assault in and of itself without armored support. Based on this, we see that the Russians launched assaults here to the southwest of Novomykhalivka, and the southern part is completely under their control. And with that, it is likely that the Russians will launch additional such assaults in the southern direction to gain control over the town, which indicates that they either gave up on the northern parts and are just moving through the southern parts and central parts to gain control over the town before connecting the town of Novomykhalivka with Pobeda to the north, which is the likely scenario as we see it right now. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Berdyshi that the fighting continues between the Russians and the Ukrainians. What we have seen this footage here of TOS strikes by the Russians on Ukrainian positions in Berdyshi. The first one is a singular one here in the road and the northern parts of Berdyshi, as is seen by this footage here. And the second one is a lot of strikes on a gathering of Ukrainian soldiers here in the central parts of Berdyshi. So we're seeing that the Russians are doing a artillery preparation. But what we're seeing is that it is reported by Russian sources that the Ukrainians have poured in a lot of reserves, a lot of reinforcements to these three villages here to the west of Avdiivka. We see here in the direction of Berdyshi, Semenivka, and Tonenka, the Ukrainians have sent a lot of reinforcements to the point at which the Russians claim that the Ukrainians currently outnumber the Russians by more than 2 to 1. This brings us back to the strategies of our good old friend General 200, also known as Syrskyi. The General 200 nickname comes from a code name that the Ukrainians and Russians are throwing around in this war, which is that 200 means death or fatality, and 300 means casualty or wounded. So when someone is hit, they shout 300 if they are hit and wounded, and you get the idea with 200. So calling Syrsky General 200 is synonymous with calling him the Butcher, which is another nickname that he has based on his performance in Bakhmut. And we're seeing that he has not changed his ways since then. Instead of withdrawing to better fortifiable positions away from the villages of Surovikin, Tonenka, and Berdishi without a single fortification, at the very least back to Semenivka and Umanske, instead of that, or even better, withdrawing to better fortified positions here to the northwest of the current Ukrainian positions, he's instead sending additional reinforcements to the point that they outnumbered the Russians over 2-1, probably 3-1 by the time of making this video, and constantly launching counterattacks to recapture these villages, which are without fortifications. Comparing it to the city of Avdiivka here to the southeast, we see that there's numerous layers of fortifications to the south and to the east of the city. They withdrew from Avdiivka, but they are refusing to withdraw from Tonenka, Surovikin, and Berdishi. This indicates that Avdiivka was not a planned withdrawal like everyone else is saying at this point, but instead it was a rout of the Ukrainians. They simply did not have necessary reinforcements and firepower to fight the Russians, and they were in very close risk of complete encirclement, which would have lost all of their lives, instead of saving at least some of them with the withdrawal that they did. Based on that, we see that the Ukrainians did not plan on losing any of these villages, much less the city of Avdiivka, but the Russians pushed on and captured most of these positions, and now the Ukrainians are trying to recapture them. But this will be a very difficult mission for them, considering that the Russians have a significant firepower advantage. The Russians can also relocate soldiers if they see that or deem that the situation here in this front line is difficult and not to the strategic advantage of the Ukrainians, yet they do it anyways when they have fortifications they can make use of. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Klishchivka, there's report that the Russians launched offensive operations yesterday, but they have so far not achieved any success. The front line remains as is, as the Russians have not made any advancements, but they have not given up there and they continue with the offensive operations, so we'll have to see with time whether they will achieve advances or not. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Sinkivka, the Russians relaunched offensive operations within the village and started storming it again, but yet again there's been no results of this so far. According to the Syriac maps, the gray zone has expanded a little bit, but that's about it. A lot of fighting is taking place, but not a lot of results right now, as the current Ukrainian strategy is pretty much to hold the front line at all costs. They're not to withdraw anywhere, they're not to give up any territory, they're instead going to send reinforcements to the point at which they will try to hold for as long as possible with as little movement as possible. And this strategy by Syrsky brings me to this article by Bloomberg, which was posted a week ago on February 29th. And it's pretty much about Ukrainian officials, unnamed. This is basically a leaked source from the office of the president of the Ukrainians, where one of them claims that the general analysis of the office of the president of Ukraine is that if things continue as is right now, the Russians will not be fighting in the Donetsk region in just 3 months from now, but instead the fighting will be going in the direction of Kiev and Odessa. Both of them, not one of them, both of them. And this will be reflected in my next analysis out of the 4 that I'll be making about the full front analysis. We have done the southern front analysis of the upcoming Russian summer offensive. The next one will be a full front analysis, which will cover the idea of the Russians attacking both Kiev and Odessa at the same time. And then in the future, we also have an eastern analysis and a northern analysis. But basically what we're seeing more so from Western analysts than Russian analysts, funnily enough, but the general trend is towards the Russians launching a massive offensive this summer, which could either fail completely and will continue with the stalemate, or we will see the Russians going for Kiev and Odessa, or possibly the whole country in and of itself. But we'll see what happens with time, and time will tell. But this video series will be my take on how I expect the Russians will go about these operations. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching and have a great day.